we had two very different presentations, but both of them tried to answer to the questions that we were posing with the symposium. So how to organize differences, and also what do we have in common. That are two of the questions that also are like taken from this idea of the publication and therefore of the symposium. Also by addressing what do we mean when we say once we were artists, trying to bring this proposition from Marion to bring it somewhere else, to shipwreck it somewhere and see when we find it back what happens. In the sense that we spoke about artistic practices and artists becoming organizers, becoming mediators in between community and government, becoming boycott organizers, becoming many different, acting in many different capacities, and always trying to respond to a contingency, always trying to respond, and as you beautifully said now by quoting the boycottologist, how do you call it, saying that how, for instance, within the boycott or within the idea of resisting to a situation you put yourself into, you're maybe trying to aspire to a different kind of art that is not yet there, and therefore this resistance becomes something to highlight this need for some other form of an artwork. So I wanted to ask both of you, how do you, in your different practices as an artist, as a curator, how have you encountered the need and the possibility to organize differences, specifically perhaps Maria by working in the outskirts of Athens, in Avlitsa, or in the area where Susitros is, and trying to look at maybe at the city, but through another lens, through another perspective, and through the communities that are not necessarily represented, that are actually misrepresented within the contemporary scenario of Athens.
Okay, first of all, I decided to have as a canvas the society, because it was so boring to be in my atelier doing paintings. I mean, I started painting and sculpture, and one day I said, what I'm doing here, alone with music, doing forms, etc. It was very boring. And then I decided to explore the city, and I started to go to the edge of the city in order to approach new people, new communities, new friends. Also in 1997, a very good friend of mine died, and it was such a big, I was very sad for 6 months. And then I didn't have appetite to do nothing or to communicate with friends, etc. So I needed something new. And I was so, how we say, happy to discover this Roma community in the suburb of Athens. Because really I found new friends, a whole community. And what we had in common with these people, and we still have, is what is missing. This is what we have in common. And we have started working on this issue. And something like else, because we spoke about activism, I don't think that the artists are activists. This is something that the documenta people always speak about. Writer, activist. Poet, activist. Performer, activist. Painter, activist. Photographer, activist. What is this? I mean, activist is someone who wants to save the people from the war, from mostly from war and situations, etc. The artists, they don't like, the aim of the artist is not to save nobody. The aim of the artist is to put justice, I think. Because the artists, they have common sense. I mean, the politicians, they don't have common sense because they work under the table, and we know how it is, and we know that we don't have countries anymore. I mean, we have enterprises, okay? So I think that the role of an artist is to put justice. And the boycott is a fantastic idea. To boycott, yes. You open up a new direction for me now, the boycott. It's really amazing. Okay. So I'm not an activist. Also, Rick Law is not an activist, you know. Thomas Hirschhorn with the Musée Précaire Albinet is not an activist. We are artists. And as Thomas, you said before about Benjamin, etc., I mean, the creation must be also immaterial. We don't need to have an object to be an artist. We can create things. Yes, we know also Bourriot and so many other people. Yeah, that is my idea. So, thank you so much for your.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, so if maybe I can add
Sure.
something to that. Of course, we know somehow this debate and those questions whether artists are activists or not, and there is those different dilemmas connected with this. But obviously, I guess many, not all of naturally, but many artists are interested in advocacy, in different forms of advocacy. But it doesn't mean they immediately need to do it and implement as an artist, but maybe they have to recognize which other groups make tedious, long-term, over the years work on those issues, and how can you work together. And this seems, on one hand, so clear, and yet so complicated for those artists who always say, no, I'm an artist, I'm not an activist. But then, if you mean it, if you mean, you know, to raise up, to catch up with these big expectations that you want your work to touch upon, then why don't you recognize, as simple as this, we are part of a society. In this society, there are other groups working on those issues in much more continuous and maybe fruitful way, and why not to bring certain maybe symbolical recognition that sometimes is missing to the activist field through art. And then it seems to me that there could be much more working, like collaborative working of advocacy through an art towards activist positions, which often seem to a little bit fight or be in the kind of counter dilemma with each other. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I don't know, Maria, how is it in your museum, so to say? Are you there? Who is working? Are you working with other people? And who are those people, and how does it work together, if I may ask?
Of course I'm working with other people. I had the idea, but it's not possible, you know, to do such a big work alone. I mean, I'm working with a lot of friends, because for me, friendship means, I mean, all my friends are collaborators also. I don't have friends that we don't do something together. Even if, I mean, they do completely different, they have completely different jobs, we work together. I'm working because I'm teaching also at the university in Athens. I'm teaching the architects, art, design, and art and environment. I have a lot of hands to help, not only to the Tama Museum, but also with Suzy Tross and all the other projects that I'm doing. And yes, there is a big group of supporters and collaborators. So finally, the project is not mine anymore, it's our project, you know.
And also one thing that is interesting here is also strategies to create solidarity, because what you just said is also the idea of also how an artist can just not appropriate strategies from other fields necessarily, but actually look into the possibility to have meaningful collaboration with other fields, may they be, you know, more activists or like people working with social work, or it's also a big difference in between just appropriating a strategy or rather like creating the possibility for a true collaboration. And where does solidarity stand in this kind of possibilities? No? Because, for instance, what Maria just said is also about trying to establish a solidarity throughout you know, different parts of her life. Her as a teacher, her as an artist, her as somebody that has colleagues that are also collaborator. And in the process also, Tom used this image at the beginning, like about privilege, you know, this deprivileging authorship. You know, you mentioned so how in the process you deprivilege the idea of the authorship, and therefore you depart even further from the idea of the artist. So also looking at the cases you studied through the boycott, how did you see artists trying to escape this idea of just appropriating a strategy of boycott, of a strategy of somebody else's work to create a rupture, in opposition to the fact of really creating bridges, creating new forms of solidarity to make, to envision different platforms and different formats.
Well, as I said, I think this is really a missing link in those boycotts. I don't think they really tried or seeked or to create a more long-term solidarity with groups that might have similar issues, or they are very often pretty detached from real social political movement. That's why maybe David Beach is saying this is a way of Occupy arriving there, you know. So it's maybe something to learn from for the future scenarios of this, I would say, of this kind.
There's a project that in the Gothenburg Biennial, because she showed I was there, so I can also act like a witness of the section of the Biennial Joanna curated. There was this project by Nuria Güell, this Spanish artist, student of Tania Bruguera, where she actually intervened on the action of the procedures of the apparatus that make, in that case in Sweden, of course, a refugee legal or not. So could you say a few words? Because in that case, I think what is interesting is that not only you have an artist that appropriated the bureaucratic apparatus and tried to play with it, but also you have an artist that created something new, thanks to using the platform of the biennial. It is something temporary, as you mentioned, or something that most of the times is not able to create strong projects because of its precarity. But in that case, something else happened. So maybe if you can say a few words about it.
Yes, sure. So, well, the project was consisting of a play hide and seek between an audience who would roam in the Göteborg harbor and an asylum seeker, a former policeman, a woman from Kosovo, called Maria for that project, but it was not her real name. And she, as a former policeman, she was also a person who had absolutely no fear to approach people, you know, and to enter in the dialogue with them, and then suggest that they would play hide and seek, and she would be always the one who is hiding, and the audience member would be one who is seeking. And this, for Nuria Güell, for the artist, Spanish artist who put it together, it was also a game that at the same time engages with the legal procedures in Sweden. And this is, of course, very important if you deal with any project that deals with refugees for the, you know, for the short time of the biennial. You cannot not think about those legal terms and what happens when an artist leaves. You know, I think we cannot be that naive to do more projects that just end when an artist leaves, you know. Which wasn't the case with Nuria. So what happened also was that this former policeman, because her, you know, with Kosovo being this now safe zone, but her already having 2 kids in Sweden, she was permanently in this no resolution zone. Also, she was like waiting for new answers, and during this time, she needed permanent jobs or permanent short-term employments from Sweden. So somehow the biennial, for a couple of months, engaged as an employer with that project too. So the project was, of course, made with an organization. This is what I was also trying to say, with how, to my sense, art and activism also can work together. So creating a pretty powerful situation, because when you just entered the harbor, there was this poster, do you want to play hide and seek with political refugee? You know, and then at one point, sometimes she was there, sometimes she was not there, and she was then telling about her case in a way. What was also interesting was that, you know, in art world we are very often privileged migrants, as you know, and back then the director of the Göteborg Biennial was curator was Eddie Muka, who is coming from Albania himself, so also not Kosovo but Albania. And at the end, the contract between Nuria Güell and Eddie well, the curator was signed, of course it was signed in Swedish, but at the end it could have been also signed in Albanian. It was an itinerary of two people who ended up in Sweden in a completely different way, coming from the same side of the world. And of course then you see, you know, what art world sometimes enables as a migration tool in some sense. So.
And also what maybe I could say also that in trying to create another bridge here is that you spoke about megaphone diplomacy, you know, this idea also how sometimes not only in cases of boycott, but also things get communicated through, of course, social media and declarations and statements that immediately they become irritated material that you know, people can respond to and so on. But on the opposite side, you have very grassroots, long-term, daily activities of speaking to people, living there, becoming, she mentioned this addicted visitor, no? So you were like going back and forth, and also this totally opposite realms in which also an artistic practice is represented. On one hand, the one that is rather ungraspable, so that it's something that you have also, it's a level that you need to trust, you know? The fact that an artist tells you, know, I'm going there every day, and you have like, and the artist establishes a relationship with the community. But on the other hand, you have artists that are very aware of the megaphone diplomacy, and they use it also as a way to deal with social issues by knowing that by making a certain statement or operating in a certain way in a biennial where a lot of attention is put, they can generate certain effects. So I was wondering also what do we have in common within this kind of totally two different speed, no? That an artist or a curator also can take advantage of, or can decide to use, and can decide to as different strategies and practices.
What do you mean, megaphone diplomacy?
I think this idea of how, you know, when you are within a biennial, the Sao Paulo biennial, or like in the case of Manifesta, that in a moment in which you make a statement because you say Manifesta shouldn't be there or stuff like that, you generate an effect, you know, that everybody today kind of respond to. Because we all are reached by this news or by this statement, or by how an artist can decide to use that kind of power, that kind of exposure, that kind of visibility to let his work happen within that kind of space. And it's something that is quite far from your practice, but many, you know, of the artists that we also were speaking about are more maybe aware of that and use it in a...
If you like to do something and you put all your heart in this, at the end you succeed. And that's for sure. Even if you have the biggest problem in front of you, at the end you succeed because you want it to have it so much. And then it's a question of values. We have to talk about values. And our society has lack of values. I think that we start from this. And if you go straight to everybody and you are sure of your idea, you know, everybody is convinced at the end. Also, the idiot governments are convinced, you know. I mean, the power of your will. I mean, this is how I think the artists, they go on. Because it's the power of their will. This is the only tool that we have. Like when you do a painting, you are in front of the white canvas. Same with the society. You don't have nothing, so you have to start from the beginning to find the first step to start, you know. But if you are, you know, if you have values, I mean, the people understand very well that you are not a fake one. They understand that they can create a net with you, you know, and slowly, slowly they are involved, and they discover that life also has another aspect except eating, drinking, shitting, and having sex. This is the first, you know, step of Hannah Arendt. Yes, there is also labor, and there is also how we live together, you know. So we live together, we are together, we have to do something, we have to deal with this, okay? And we have to exist as human beings. I mean, my work at Venice Biennial about why look at animals, αγριμικά, it was about this. I mean, our connection with the animals, what connects us to the animals, you know, and the fear we have in front of something very wild, you know, how you rethink the value of your life when you are in front of fear, you know. Because, I mean, for some people life is so easy, but from the most of the people, life is very hard, you know, and we have to deal with this. Anyway, but, okay, I'm not Maria Teresa from Albania, you know, because finally we discovered some years ago that the role of Maria Teresa was a little bit tricky. Have you read the articles about Maria Teresa? That she destroyed, in a way, some villages in India? I mean, okay, so that's why we must be careful of activism. But you know something? There are so many interesting people here. Why they don't ask us something?
That's what I was about to do. We open the floor to questions.
Okay, sorry.
Of course. I don't know if Joanna wants to say anything.
No.
Okay. So if there are questions, that's the moment when you might, even if you have like more curiosities about passages of the presentations that were not clear, or like specific projects. Shall we continue then? Until, no, there's a question there. Whitney.
Hi, I'm Whitney. Thank you so much for your presentations. They're really interesting and critical, and you gave some examples of how this worked, but I'm always really interested in like the specific practices and how they've been developed. So talking about the works and kind of what you were discussing, Matteo, about appropriating boycott or appropriating different kinds of strategies like community work in creating art spaces. What kinds of strategies have you found out that work, or maybe work less when doing something like trying to create a community collaborative project, or when shifting strategies that maybe come from activisms and putting them into art practices?
You want to answer, Marion?
Yes. Okay. First of all, you must be generous. This is the first. Secondly, you have to keep an eye on what you are doing. You have to invest time, and you have to create trust between the people, you know. And the strategy is nothing more than to be there and work together and living together. Share every day together. If you don't live together, you don't understand what is going on. And I would like to say that I became very rich with my involvement with different people, societies, groups, etc. Because this work is an interactive work. I mean, we give and we take all the time, you know. Those people, the alien, because we call them at the beginning, we don't know them. They have so many things to teach us, you know. I became a much good seller of my work after my, let's say, friendship with the gypsies. Before, it was terrible. I could not sell. They asked me how much it cost, these sculptures. I said, I don't know, take it for free. I was afraid. I was ashamed to rent my stuff. But the gypsies taught me very well how to do it, you know. Yes, no, this is true. This is true. And then from another group of people, I learned how to sew. I mean, that's why I made a lot of workshops with sewing machines, etc. And at the end, we created the firma Gypsy Globales. I mean, I learned also a little bit guitar. I mean, to cook different food. I mean, it's interaction. This is important.
And this is also something that became an aspect in your practice, like with Susie Tross, trying to use what you said, like living together. So use food, the effect of gathering for lunches and dinner in order to do something else together, I guess. And starting from a time of when Susie was eating a lot. So.
Yes. You know something? When they come to Susie, to the art canteen, the people, they don't know why they're invited there. Anyway, I invite everybody through internet, newspaper, etc. So they come because they are curious to see what is this art canteen in the middle of nowhere. So, but when they leave the space after 5, 8, 10 hours, they say, okay, now we know why we were here. We came without knowing what we're gonna do, but now we know why we were here. And what they feel is that they participate together in something. And this something every time has a title. And this is my work, let's say, to name every event. To name every event. So they come and they interact. And of course I cook this trahana soup, which is something very cheap. I mean, with 10 euro you can feed 50, 55 people. It's something very cheap and good for health. And also it's a historical food because it's the breakfast, petit déjeuner for ancient Greek people. Yes.
Well, my answer would be a little bit more less emotional. But you know, one thing that researching those boycotts comes to mind is also what is actually, you know, curators very often have certain privileges, but also what is the responsibility that is coming with curating. And probably one of it, and especially in the projects where you claim you work politically, so not only about political issues, but you claim that you want to have maybe some political effects or some kind of mediation or whatever, that it's very important to anticipate things and to be prepared that if there is some kind of a conflict or misunderstanding that appears, that you have a scenarios how to deal with that. I think this is kind of crucial. It's not only imminent to art, or maybe not, you know, I mean, it's just in general, we know it actually from political strategies, or we know it from non-violent struggles, movements, you know, that you think what would be the next steps if you really mean what you wrote in your curatorial statement, you know. So yeah. So this, as I said, with this book, I hope that somehow looking and talking to these different artists and curators and board members, that you might then think for yourself, how would you do it, and to be prepared to be there for the situation, maybe when the artist leaves and still you want to work with what art has produced or initiated.
Question from Marion?
Is on? Yeah, sorry. Actually, no question, more a comment, maybe, or something to add. I think it's interesting when you think about artistic critique from the white cube and critiquing the conditions of production, the address, the interpellation of the artist as a passive, non-voice person who would actually need always somebody to speak about her or him. In taking the voice, making it yourself, but also in terms of an institutional critique and history of institutional critique. I think the boycotts have to be discussed in that kind of frame, because the biennial is one kind of event, and that does not might have white cube kind of walls, but it definitely has structures, political conditions in the attention economy that we are living today, and I think there we are all part. You know, and whatever we do, if you do a social project, if you do a boycott, if you're a curator, if you do a work, a sculpture, or whatever, a part of the attention economy. And for me, this question would not only be in terms of this how do you say, megaphone diplomacy, but also in terms of how we deal with these attention economies, where also our names are used for whatever, marketing, education programs, etc. Pepe. And I think that's a really crucial question, because it would actually acknowledge the political and economical conditions we are in. And it's not so much a moral question, I would say. It's, for me, hardly political question. The other thing is that I like to answer why one shipwrecks in the harbor. It's about bankruptcy. You know, it's about debts. The ship's owners get bankrupt. And the ships are owned by the banks. And as it is too expensive to destroy them, they are in the harbor. They are a sign of a specific economy that we are living in which actually also ownership shifts into diverse directions, and they are somehow ruins of our own kind of societal conditions. They are maybe the temples, the folly architectures of our, how do you say, landscape gardens that we are living in.
I think we have room for another question, unless Maria and John, they want to comment more on what Marion just said. Then we can maybe wrap it up a little bit and go towards the lunch break. And but I wanted to just maybe a final remark on what we just. Also, it's interesting, I think, to see two different practices, one an artistic and curatorial one that I've been busy trying to reconfigure every time the way in which Maria as an artist and Joanna as a curator, their role can also become every time something else in order to respond to contingency, to urgent questions, to burning questions that were on the plate, rather through a biennial or through a community organizing activity. And I think that this kind of case studies will stay with us for the further for the following part of the symposium. And I think for now we can go to have a lunch break, and we see each other in an hour time with the second block and the third one. Thanks so much.